Welcome to this panel tonight in the Haus am Dom in the Catholic Academy here in Frankfurt, for those who are here, and of course also for those who are on the screen. It's my pleasure to be here in this house, which is actually very active in Jewish-Christian dialogue or interfaith dialogue generally. We have a few series, for example, rabbinisch gesehen, from a rabbinic point of view, mostly about the topics of the annual themes of this house. And we have other lectures, and of course also activism. Joachim Valentin, who is the host tonight, has organized, for example, a demonstration against anti-Semitism recently here in Frankfurt with 6,000 participants and 6,000 lights against the hatred of Jews. Now, one of the co-sponsors is the Zentrum Ökumene, the Ecumenical Center, and I would like to welcome Peter Noss, who just says a few words of welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ecumenical Center and the German Coordination Council of the Societies for Christian-Jewish Cooperation, I would like to welcome you all to this event. My name is Peter. October 7 marks a profound turning point. Never since the Holocaust has there been such a cruel pogrom from Hamas against Jewish people. This has terrible consequences, not only in Israel, but for Jews all over the world, especially also in Germany, but also for the people of Gaza and our society and the international community as a whole. Anti-Semitism in his various forms has increased dramatically from the left, from the right, from Arab Islamistic side, in churches also. Incidents such as the one at Humboldt University in Berlin last week have led to an increased security effort also tonight. We must stand up against this, and that is what happens when 20,000 citizens from Frankfurt protest against right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism and racism in Frankfurt, at the Frankfurt Roma, not far away from here, as they did a week ago on Monday, because it affects us all. As Christians and churches, we have a special responsibility, theologically, historically, and also politically. I'm very pleased to hear from the 4 or 5 people on the podium today from different perspectives on these issues and to learn what needs to be considered and could be done now. One more note. On Thursday this week from 6 to 8 p.m. the Buber-Rosenzweig lecture will take place at Goethe University in Frankfurt on the West End campus in the Casino building, where Dr. Karma Ben-Huanan, she's on the podium, will speak on the topic Christian ambivalence and the current anti-Semitism debate. Thank you.
My name is Elisabeth Engler-Stark. I'm a member of the board of Im Dialog, in Dialogue, the Protestant Council for Christian-Jewish Dialogue in Hesse and Nassau. I'm both grateful and proud to welcome you all, also in the name of our chair, David Schnell, who sends his warmest regards, but unfortunately cannot join us tonight. Out of blindness and guilt, the church is called to repentance. The church bears witness to the lasting election of the Jews and God's covenant with them. The confession of Jesus Christ includes this witness. In 1991, the Protestant Church of Hessen and Nassau added these 2 sentences to the preamble of its constitution. Constantly reviving this awareness of the responsibility of Christians towards Jews in the theological work of our church is one task that we, im Dialog, dedicate our work to. We are doing so by encouraging Christians to incorporate the knowledge gained from encounters with Judaism into Christian preaching, community, and teaching. Therefore, I want to thank the initiators of this event for the idea for this event and for making it possible for us to host this event this evening together with the German Coordination Council of the Societies for Christian-Jewish Cooperation and the Ecumenical Center. October 7th was a turning point in history. Things are fundamentally different for many individual people, Jews and non-Jews, for a whole region and all its political affairs. But things are also different in interreligious dialogue as well. A so-called theology after Auschwitz was a Christian answer to the utter failure facing the Shoah. It is important until today for shaping the Christian-Jewish dialogue, especially here in Germany. And after October 7th, 2023, I heard several voices, especially from fellow Protestant theologians, voting for a similar shift and claiming the necessity of a theology after October 7th. The Jewishness of Jesus has been a theological topic for decades. In one of our publications with the title Christian Faith in its Jewish Context, the former chair of our council, Ulrich Schwemer, stated, "The crucial point is that Jesus himself remained within Judaism and did not leave it. The view of Jesus of Nazareth as a person is fundamentally changing when his statements, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, are not read as if they were directed against Judaism, but are recognized in their rootedness in Judaism." Our historical and theological insights, combined with a special responsibility of Christians in the fight against antisemitism, may inform a new approach in the aforementioned theology after October 7th. I'm looking forward to hear what insights and developments tonight will bring us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this warm welcome in the Haus am Dom and your words of greetings. We are here as members of a symposium on Christ Jesus the Jew, and we are meeting for the second time. We met the first time in Philadelphia a year ago, and this is our second meeting. We're all members of this group, thinking about the Jewishness of Jesus, and we were asked to reflect on the Jewishness of Jesus in the wake of October 7. And none of us come prepared with statements. We want to have a conversation amongst ourselves, and as we were thinking about this, we thought we would start by introducing ourselves and our particular subject positions. And so we have tonight 3 Christians and 2 Jews. I represent the German-American Lutheran position. Dan will represent the Episcopalian American. A.J. Levine will represent the diasporic Jewish perspective, Karma, the Israeli, and Michael Azar, the Arab Orthodox perspective. So we come from different backgrounds, and we have been affected by October 7 in different ways. And so we will each introduce ourselves and talk personally. And we thought that this was important because so many of the words in this debate have become toxic and combative. And so my charge to the panelists as a moderator was to say that if you use words like anti-Semitism, racism, apartheid, genocide, colonialism, Zionism, anti-Zionism, terrorism, or war crimes, you have to define it. Because these words have taken on a life of their own, and they have become labels. And so we want to, if we use the words, we want to ground them in our particular subject positions. And so I want to start with myself. My name is Katharina von Kellenbach. I work at the Evangelische Akademie zu Berlin in a project called Bildstörungen, which is dedicated to change the images of Jews in religious education and theology. And my entire career has been dedicated to think theologically through the Holocaust. So I am a prime example of German Vergangenheitsbewältigung and trying to understand what happened in the Holocaust. And so I approach the topic of Christ Jesus the Jew as a post-Shoah development. That is to say, before and during the Shoah, Jesus was an Aryan, or certainly not Jewish, and Jesus fought against Judaism. That was the tradition. And the shock of the murder of 6 million Jews in Europe prompted the churches to rethink our traditions and to demand that the Jewishness of Jesus comes to consciousness. And so the topic of our symposium, Christ Jesus a Jew, is, from my perspective, a post-Shoah event. And when I saw images of October 7, when men were celebrating over the corpses of dead Jews in trucks, I mean, that image of the celebration of corpses on trucks, that resonates to me with the memory of family members that I have who killed Jews and celebrated. So that is, to my mind, a form of Jew hatred that is very much part of my historical experience as a German Christian. And so I see Jew hatred in those scenes, and to my mind, that is where we as churches, as Christians, have said, this we will not tolerate, this we will not observe, this we will not do again. And so my recent research topics were on guilt and repentance. And when Maimonides talks about tshuva, repentance, one way in which you can test whether your guilt has been, whether you have repented, it is that if you're in the same situation, you will react differently. You will not do the same thing again. And so I think from a German theological perspective, this explains why the position has been never again is now. And this is sort of the claim that has been made in the public sphere. This is how the Minister of the Economy, Wirtschaftsminister Robert Habeck, in his video declared the security of the State of Israel part of the German Staatsräson. Right? This is our responsibility, that the murder of Jews is not tolerated, cannot happen again. That does not mean that the government of Israel is not, what's the word I'm looking for, highly problematic in many respects. There have been demonstrations for months. There's lots and lots of need for discussion. And that what has resulted, the suffering that has resulted, is also horrific. Although, of course, German anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, was also ended on the battlefield. And the German experience is also the experience of aerial bombardments Dresden and Hamburg, and horrible destruction. So we know the consequences of anti-Semitism as well in many respects. And so when I think about what October 7 means, then it is really a renewed commitment to understand the power of Jew hatred and to extend also the invitation to Palestinians not to walk the path of that kind of hatred, whatever that may mean. I mean, that is not to mean that there's not a conflict, there's not to mean that there's injustice and oppression and violence and occupation and all of that stuff. But anti-Semitism is not the path forward. It actually makes it worse. And so I think we, as Christians, also have a responsibility to enter into dialogue with Muslims and with Christians around the world, in the global south, Christians of color, to really think about how anti-Semitism functions in Christian theology and to enter into that dialogue. So that is my very vulnerable opening remarks on this. What we will do is we will go around with these introductions, and then we will enter into a round of questions, first among the panel, and then we can also invite the rest of the audience to join in the conversation. Again, the goal is to model a conversation in a moment of violence. And that's, I think, very, very hard, because violence hardens boundaries, and violence creates very hard identities, and it's very hard to then find pathways across different groups. And so what we're trying to do on this panel, because we have prior relationships in Christian-Jewish relationships, is to model conversations that are rooted in our experiences and that are as truthful and open as we can be. So here's my question to the panel then. How has October 7 affected your understanding, your engagement, your expectations of Christian-Jewish relations? And what are your fears and hopes as we enter into dialogue with each other? And I'm beginning with Dan, and you get to say your last name, because I'm not going to try.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Jocelyn Simitowski. I'm a professor of Jewish-Christian relations at Boston College, which is a Jesuit Catholic university located in Boston, Massachusetts. And I direct the Center for Christian-Jewish Learning there. As part of my background, I was raised as an evangelical Protestant in America, not evangelical like here in Germany, but evangelical like in America. And have since joined the Episcopal Church, where I'm a priest. The Episcopal Church is the American branch of the Anglican Communion in the United States. So, and part of what got me into this work as a Christian, first as an evangelical and then as an Episcopalian, beginning my undergraduate career at university, was the sense of a moral responsibility that Christians have to answer for the legacy of anti-Semitism and the Shoah as representative of that, but not limited to that. And in my doctoral studies, I specialized in early and medieval Jewish-Christian relations, and really had the sense that there was a moral responsibility for me, once I had this knowledge, to educate others about it and work to undo anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And we could talk about the difference between those later. And so Jesus as a Jew was, of course, just a fundamental fact for that. So I want to offer some reflections around my own work with educating about anti-Semitism in the United States over the past couple of years. First, before October 7th, and then after October 7th. So before October 7th, there was a high degree of receptivity in the sort of liberal Protestant circles that I mostly do my work within. People were very shocked by violent incidents of anti-Semitism in the United States, whether it was the various massacres at synagogues, the riot at the University of Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I talked to clergy, they would want to mobilize against right-wing anti-Semitism and would take the symbol of Jesus as Jew as kind of a unifying idea that gave them the energy to do that work. When I woke up on the morning of October 7th, I was one of the few Christians in my social media feed who seemed to be aware that something was happening. I think that was because I had my own connections to Israelis, and I could see what was being communicated. And over that weekend, some of my Christian clergy colleagues had a dawning realization that something had happened, but they couldn't quite place the event. And so there seemed to be a vacuum of awareness, and then a week of unfolding shock. But one of the things that became quite obvious was that the official Christian bodies I was aware of in the United States were slow to issue statements. And when they issued statements, they tried to be balanced. Rather than simply condemning October 7th, there was also a need to speak about occupation. And that came out of a variety of commitments. One of them is represented in my church, the Episcopal Church, where we officially affirm the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security, and a desire to see the establishment of a Palestinian state or homeland, wherever that might look like. And so there's a sense of needing to balance out the two narratives. And October 7th was a moment where, at least from my perspective, one narrative had to be foregrounded in that moment. And since then, I think we've been in various stages of having, in my context, of having to account for the progress of the war, how to adjudicate the morality of military tactics, how to look to the day after, and what the future might be for the various peoples who have been impacted. My fears, though, lay in the trajectory that my own grouping of Protestants might take after, the day after. And I'll tell it this way as a story and then explain the fear a little bit. I've been doing a lot of work of educating around issues of anti-Semitism in Holy Week, and especially around the Good Friday liturgy. And invariably, when I'm trying to talk to clergy about here is why we want to avoid language of anti-Semitism and hostility towards Jews on Good Friday, looking especially at things like the Passion Gospel of John, I'll get a question from clergy that basically says, but what about the war? How can we only talk about the problems of anti-Semitism when this war is also happening? And for me, that represents a kind of collapsing of two different sets of problems and wanting to lay one over the other rather than holding them apart as different problems to solve. And so I think, at least in the liberal Protestant Christian imagination, there's a constant collapsing of the problem of anti-Semitism and the problem of the disenfranchisement of Palestinians and the conduct of the war in Gaza. And so my fear is that due to the outcome of the war in Gaza, churches like mine will go further down the road of, say, boycott, divest, sanctioning, and the labeling of Israel as an apartheid state as a means of standing for justice without seeing how that might actually reinforce some latent anti-Semitism within their own discourses, where they collapse the conduct of Israel onto the question of Jewishness and Jewish-Christian relations. It's a complex narrative I'm trying to unfold here, but I hope I've illuminated some of that for you, so thank you.
Hello. I'm a Jew. I live in the diaspora. I don't speak for diasporan Jews. I can just speak for me, because it's not as if all Jews have the same opinion about everything. Not only do I live in the diaspora, I live in the state of Tennessee. So I live in the American South. I live in Donald Trump country, which would not be the same thing were I in my hometown, which is in Massachusetts. I'm invested in Jewish-Christian relations because when I was a child, just 60 years ago, a little girl said to me when I was 7 years old, "You killed our Lord." And I said, "I did not kill anyone, because if you killed somebody, you would know." And she announced to me, "Yes, you did. Our priest said so." This was a very Roman Catholic area of Massachusetts. I thought the reason that Catholic priests had to wear special collars was because were the priest to tell a lie, the collar would choke the priest, which I still think is a very good idea. So I said to this little girl who said, the priest said I killed God, I said, "Is the priest dead?" Figuring this was such a lie, the collar would have killed the priest. And she said no. So I, being a rational child, thought, the priest said I killed God, the collar did not kill the priest, therefore I must be guilty of deicide. I came home, I was crying, and my mother met me at the school bus and said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I killed God." She told me that God was fine, which was good news. And I started to ask questions. I didn't know what Protestants were. I think I met the first Protestant who occurred, this must be a Protestant, when I went to university. So I grew up in this Catholic neighborhood, and I was intrigued by what my Catholic friends were doing, whether it was parades through the streets, or the Feast of the Blessed Sacrament. I had been in Catholic churches, and I thought they were beautiful. I like statues. I mean, not in my synagogue, but I like statues. My parents told me that a Jewish man named Jesus and a Jewish woman named Mary were very important. So my initial sense of Christianity was it was very much like Judaism. We worshiped the same God, the one who created heaven and earth. We read the same books like Genesis or Isaiah or the Psalms. We both followed the Ten Commandments variously, the Decalogue, and then there was this Jewish man and Jewish woman. So when I finally read the New Testament several years later, two things occurred to me. The first thing that occurred to me in reading the New Testament is one can read the New Testament and become a Jew hater, someone who hates Jews. But that was not necessary, because the Catholics who were teaching me what I was learning in religious education school in the local Catholic church did not hate Jews. So it occurred to me, first thing, that we choose how to read. I did not have the vocabulary for that at the time. We would call it hermeneutics, the art of interpretation. So I thought, if somebody can teach me how we can read this text and not develop Jew hatred, I want to know what that is so I can teach other people. And the other thing that occurred to me was that this was all Jewish history that I was reading about. The first person in literature ever called rabbi is Jesus of Nazareth. The only Pharisee from whom we have written records is Paul of Tarsus. So my sense was, I'm getting Jewish history back, but thanks to the church that preserved this documentation. So I thought, not only can I work to help Christians avoid developing Jew hatred, I could help Jews better understand their Christian neighbors and better understand our own history. And I figured if I could not get a job doing this, I would go to law school. But I got a job, so I'm now Professor Emeritus, Emerita, I have retired, from Vanderbilt University, both the Divinity School, where I work to train Christian clergy, and the Department of Religious Studies. And I now teach for Hartford International University for Religion and Peace in Connecticut, where my job is to help chaplains and pastoral caregivers and people involved in social programs, Muslims and Jews as well as Christians, how to read the New Testament. So I'm teaching New Testament to Muslims, and I'm teaching New Testament to Jews, and in some cases I'm teaching New Testament to Christians. What I found in light of what happened, I was actually in Bonn the day of the atrocities, and I was very worried because I did not know what to expect. Germany still makes me a little nervous. I could not have been made more comfortable. The people in the town, the people at the university were as affirming as possible, and I felt safer in Bonn than I felt when I went back to the United States because of difficulties on college campuses. So thank you, Germany. What I found in terms of the change of dialogue is something that had already been happening. Following the attacks on American soil in 2011, a number of church synagogue programs or Jewish-Christian dialogues were stopped because the Christian partners thought it was more important to invest their resources in Muslim-Christian dialogue than in Jewish-Christian dialogue, and they thought that the Jewish problem had been resolved. No, they said, there's no more Jew hatred in the liturgy, there's no more anti-Semitism, however you want to define those terms. So they determined that the problem no longer existed, and they put their investment into Muslim-Christian dialogue, which actually did not work very well. The problems had not been resolved, and the fact that they hadn't been resolved came to the fore following the events that are here. More so in liberal Protestantism than among my Catholic friends and my more conservative Protestant friends. That would be American evangelicalism. I find a bifurcation, what's sometimes suggested to be ideological purity. If you're on this side, you have to agree with the following groups who are oppressed. So if you believe that this particular group, because of race, because of gender, because of ethnicity, is oppressed, and now there are other oppressed people, then you can't hold a more sophisticated view of things. It's become very difficult to advocate for anything dealing with Israel because the general view, at least among the liberal people with whom I'm working, is everything Israel does is bad. The system was blighted from the beginning, and occupation means 1948 on, not 1967. So what I'm seeing is a hardening of certain anti-Israeli views, and then that crosses over into anti-Jewish views. So I have had Christians say to me, why don't you, meaning me personally, why don't you stop the bombing? As if I'm responsible for it. And this is just an unfortunate stereotype that's a legacy of what had gone on before, as if Jews have all the power, or American Jews are actually spending all of our investment in Israel militarism, and all American Jews support Mr. Netanyahu, which is by no means the case. I'm seeing an increase in anti-Jewish stereotype being impacted. All Jews are warlike, Old Testament God of wrath, to use the Christian terminology. Jews only want Jews living within a Jewish nation, and if you're not Jewish, you can't live there, forgetting about all the non-Jews who were citizens of the state of Israel. All Jews are white, forgetting about the majority Israeli population, which is not. So it's a hardening of some of those views. And the thing that I find most distressing is the inability to acknowledge each other's pain. So to say to some of my Christian friends, well, what about over 1,000 Jews who were killed? What about the hostages? Well, that's not the problem. The problem is something else. That's the problem too. On the other hand, I have seen in synagogue contexts the same sort of whataboutism. So if I say, well, here are these babies that have just been killed because a bomb just got dropped on their house. Well, but what did Hamas do? And there's this inability to acknowledge that people are suffering on all sides of this question. And part of this is, I think, based on the sense of ideological purity. If you're part of this group, you cannot acknowledge Palestinian suffering, and anything that Israel does is fine because for some Christians, we're the chosen people, so we can do what we want. And on the other side, everything Israel does is wrong because Jews are bad and Israel is bad. So that bifurcated language has continued. What I've been spending an increasing amount of time doing in working with Christian congregations is explaining to Christians why Jews care about the land in the first place. because most of my Christian friends think of Jews as simply a faith community or religion, rather than understanding Jewish identity is based in peoplehood. And peoplehood is not just a faith conception. You can be a Jew and an atheist. It's very easy to do. But a sense of, here's a common ancestry, here's a common land, here's a common language, here's continuity across the centuries. And my Christian friends have no idea about why Jews care about the land in the first place, even to questions of liturgy. So for those of you who are on the lectionary, if you're Jewish, the lectionary is the Parsha HaShavua for Christians. If you read the Tanakh, if you read the Torah, you'll hear the promise of the land over and over and over again. But if the way you get your, to use the Christian term, Old Testament delivered is via the lectionary, you don't hear the promise of the land except for once, because it's not important. In the New Testament, because of translation issues, the promise of the land goes missing, so we hear it in the Hebrew, we might not hear it in the German or in the English. So Christians, because of the way worship is set up, simply do not understand how Jews generally think of ourselves, not just as a religion, but also as a people.
Thank you. I normally start by saying, thank you, I'm happy to be here. That's all I have to say about that. No, I'm uncomfortable to be here. I wish this weren't a thing. I wish October 7th weren't a thing. I wish the response or aftermath of October 7th weren't an ongoing thing. I wish anti-Semitism weren't a thing. I have a lot of wishes that, long story short, I don't start with, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I can tell you the perspective that I come from, but also say I don't represent that perspective. That part I would disagree with our moderator. I don't want to say I represent that perspective. I'm the child of Lebanese immigrants to the United States. I come from an Orthodox, well, half Orthodox, half Catholic, but in good Lebanese fashion. My dad is Orthodox, so that's the way I grew up. I have a lot of experience growing up in probably even more worse than Tennessee in the way that AJ described it. I grew up in the state of Wyoming, where being Lebanese was not a great thing to be in the 1980s. And I have a lot of that in my background, even though I grew up after that in Egypt and then came back. So I do bring to Jewish-Christian relations, both an Orthodox and I guess you could say an Arab perspective. And then in much of my more recent life, I've worked very closely with the Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which oversees the majority Christian population in the entire land. Still the majority, I think, at last count. It's maybe a little debatable. And I've worked very closely with them there. I think my entry into Jewish-Christian relations started as a biblical student. I was interested in early Jewish-Christian interaction. And long story short, to keep it in 5 minutes, which has been liberally defined, I think. In reading the literature that I was reading, there was, long story short, a lot of stereotypes about many important theological sources that Orthodox theology holds to be valuable. A lot of stereotypes about patristic sources, other sources that I felt were exactly that, stereotypes. And I can cite many specific examples, a lot of specifically anti-Arab or at least severely misunderstanding Arab portrayals, if not anti-Arab. And so that's kind of what drew me into the world of contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. I went from the ancient stuff to being more invested in the contemporary stuff from an Orthodox Christian perspective, and very quickly realizing that not much has been done on that, or by some people's standards in that, Orthodox Christian-Jewish relations. But my focus has been, because of my work with the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, the region, my focus has been on the experience and experiences, concerns of the local Christian communities. That has, I would say, is arguably the group of Christians in the world that has been most affected by the contemporary quote-unquote, situation being a part of Jewish-Christian relations elsewhere. Discussions about the land has affected no Christian group as much as it's affected those that live there, even though they were very often not represented in the discussions. And so October 7th, the last time I was in Jerusalem, and mostly Bethlehem, was about a year ago. I think that was the last time prior to October 7th, teaching a class on Christianity in the Middle East, and I took my students a lot to the Christian communities, which are primarily Palestinian, and we spent most of our time in the West Bank. And a clear sentiment that I wish we didn't have to express was what was becoming increasingly clear to us was that the situation would not hold much longer. Knowing history and, what has led to violent acts of violence in the past, and then just contemporary experience. So in that sense, October 7th, while the significant, how do I say, the size of it, I guess you could say the surprise and the size of it were, and then as the details came out, the actual physical details of it were very shocking on October 7th when I heard the news, and I guess I heard it earlier than Dan's Christian group, perhaps, as someone invested in local events, was deeply shocking. And my next, I guess you could say, personal concern was what was going to happen next, and how it would affect the people with whom I've been writing, discussing for so long. And so calling October 7th a turning point is, I think, the expression that was used here. I would say, at least in the small aspect of those affected that I have spent the most time investigating, which would be the local Christian community, by no means decentralizing any other, it's just personally the one that I have been most focused on. It was, I don't know if I can call it a turning point in the same way that it is for others, because things had in a sense, already been on the decline, and it was clear there was going to be more of a decline. So in that sense, for that group that I'm most concerned about, or that I've worked the most closely with, I can't really call it a turning point per se. A significant move maybe, but I don't know about a turning point. To address the issue of anti-Semitism, more broadly speaking, like I said at the beginning, I wish it's not an issue that we had to address, but it is, it's a reality. And I go primarily, as an American, I go primarily on FBI statistics. That's the group that I follow for actually tracking hate crimes, or what's loosely grouped as hate crimes. And yes, it is on the rise. I like to pretend without saying, without sounding as like it's a cop-out or a false attempt at sympathy. I like to, I like to think that I try, to prevent it when I can, or whatever I say can, whether in one-on-one conversations or the things that I say, to help the fight against it. For me personally, the rise in anti-Arabism, I guess would be the word to call it. I don't think Islamophobia is the right word, because people often don't know whether a person's Muslim or not. For me personally, has been my personal concern. In the United States, there have been multiple, I think, shootings and stabbings now of Arab Americans. That's been very concerning for me. In a way that I just, not being Jewish, I experience anti-Semitism from the outside, so to speak, but this one I experience from the inside. Perhaps I will leave it out there for now. Yeah, why not?
You never mentioned your name.
Oh, I am sorry. That's the least important information about me. I am Michael. For those of you that have a proper Semitic alphabet, Azar, or Azar in American. I teach at the University of Scranton, a Jesuit university in Northeast Pennsylvania. And I'm ordained in the Orthodox Church.
Okay, I'm Karma Ben Yochanan. I teach at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the Department of Comparative Religion. So, yeah, I'm the Israeli. I don't know if I'm representative of anything, but this is what I also want to talk about. So, like Michael, I also feel that it's a difficult position to be in, and so I chose to say very mild things. I hope you'll sympathize with that. So I would like to start by saying something about my background. I have a very complex family in Israeli terms. So within my close family, there are people that are very religious and people that are very secular, people that are very right-wing and people that are very left-wing, and also Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews. So somehow my life experience was trying to navigate between all these contrasts, or seeing if there is anything that can be composed of all these contradictions, and basically I think most of all just living with them, of being not totally consistent and having multiple faces. This is who I am. This is also one of the reasons that eventually I chose to stay in Israel, because this is a life story that many Israelis somehow have. And I think this is also part of the reason why I was inspired to get into the business of Jewish-Christian dialogue and Jewish-Christian relations, because this is also a very contradictory relationship that has many faces. It has a lot of hope invested in it in recent decades. After the Shoah, after the war, things significantly changed in this relationship. So it carries this promise of reconciliation, of bettering, of repentance, of tshuva, which is something very optimistic. But in a sense, the hardcore, the tension is always very close to the surface. It's enough to open some books and immediately it pops up, unless you have somebody like AJ mediating things to you properly. And unfortunately, we don't always have you around. And this is also true in terms of the Jewish perspective, of course. Of course, we have a lot of prejudice also within the Jewish tradition. Somehow, I think, because Israelis are very often a bit less sensitive to, I don't know if to call it anti-Semitism, it really is a very charged term, but to Jew hatred, to prejudice against Jews. So also, I think as an Israeli, we have some kind of freedom also to do some difficult work with our own texts. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist in other places, but this is something that I think was important for me to bring into the Jewish-Christian dialogue, at least prior to October 7th. So in a sense, the way I experienced Jewish-Christian dialogue was also that it's about the encounter, but it's also about having a chance to reflect on your own problems, right? To take seriously the shifts that one needs to take. And so this complexity of Jewish-Christian relations, the place of anxiety there, that somehow everything will come back, right? There is always this idea that if we won't be careful, then the demons will reappear. And on the other hand, the ability to see this intimacy, the way that these communities and these traditions are, can you say intricate in English? There is an intricate. Okay. Whatever. Right, I'm allowed to be an Israeli for a moment. Okay, so, right, but there is this entanglement that is very prominent there. So this is something that I liked about it. And in a sense, October 7th, and now I'm not going to speak about the violence, the physical violence, and the experience of the destruction, neither of Israelis nor of Palestinians. I want to talk about something civilizational or cultural or intellectual. And I think it's also important, and something about our ability to hold complexities together, to be many things at once. I feel that it broke in a sense that for me, for example, it's almost the demands both of my own community, either the Israeli community or the larger Jewish community that I feel very much a part of, I would say even more after October 7. But there is a very strong demand of belonging. One has to know where your primary loyalties are. And this means that really it is hard to pronounce how terrible it is to see what is happening in Gaza. And one wants to be in both places. One wants to be in the sadness, in the horror of the amount of destruction that is experienced by people there, by children there. But also not hate Israel, not negate Israel, not think that all we are is vengeful, bloodthirsty people. And again, yes, we have the Netanyahu issue, and it is very hard now to think about diversity in this situation. And I'm not sure that there is something to do about it. This is somehow naturally we are breaking into pieces whatever complexity we managed to somehow hold together. Now it's breaking down, and it's experienced also in personal relationships, in friends that me personally, I'm losing many friends in this situation, and that's also tragic. Again, it's the less tragic part, perhaps, but I do feel that there is some kind of a break in a civilizationary break in terms of what is the horizon, what is the framework of what we are allowed to be, in a sense. And now going back to Jewish-Christian relations, sometimes I feel that this is really sensed in the body somehow, that with some Christian counterparts, even some that I felt very close to before, there is suddenly this gap of belongings, of loyalties, and you never know. I mean, part of what's so difficult is that you never know if you're imagining what the other person is thinking about you, or rather, you really see your reflection as something horrific in the other partner's eyes. So there is always this question of who's imagining the projection and who's really projecting. So I guess my only expectation, we weren't sure how to frame the questions here because it's so sensitive and complex. But Katerina suggested also asking about the expectations. I think expectations, maybe it's a big word, almost like hope, which is not, it's still irrelevant. Hope is still irrelevant because we don't even have a framework of who we are at the moment. But I would say that something about remembering how complicated human life and human belongings and loyalties are. I would very much like to know that the Christians that I am in touch with remember that. And I hope that I can also remember that on them.
Okay. Thank you for this very, I think we all managed to avoid the buzzwords and to speak from the heart. And I think that is one of the, as you put it, you know, the part of a relationship means to endure the complexity and to accept the suffering of the other. And so I think I want to thank you all for, you know, for opening up this round. Now, I wonder whether there are particular questions that that we might have of each other. Otherwise, I was going to, you know, ask the question that you already answered, namely about the expectations, because I think that, and I'm speaking here of the diaspora, so to speak, that there are certain expectations of how one ought to position oneself vis-a-vis. You know, we are asked to take sides. And we're asked from both sides in this conflict. And so I wonder whether you would speak to that. I mean, what your expectations are, and maybe, you know, maybe from our side, what it means to be asked to take sides, and how to either take sides or resist taking sides, and what does that mean? You know, what does it mean to refuse to take sides and then be indifferent? Or, you know, I mean, what are some of the ethical issues in this position? And I guess to some extent, I mean, you're also asked to take sides. You know, we're all in this together. But maybe I would ask, you know, start with you, and maybe Michael, particularly also, if you just sort of frame. I mean, what would Palestinian Christians ask? What do Palestinian Christians ask of us? And I know that's a representative, you know, I know you were refusing to play that role, yeah. But I still think it would be good to hear something, you know, something to that effect.
I will do my best with, like, I don't know, 2 caveats at the beginning, emphasizing that I don't represent. 3 caveats. It's not unified. Well, maybe on this issue, maybe part of it will be. And citing something that I think AJ has been credited with noting somewhere about anti-Jewish preaching. It was in the context of stereotypes and anti-Jewish preaching. There's a recommendation to pastors and ministers to just picture a Jew in the front row of their congregations whenever they're saying something. And so that's something I would invite all of us to do, and I would try to do in this case. As far as I know, one aspect not represented is someone from Gaza. Picturing in the room. Yeah, Palestinian Christians have been quite clear: humanitarian aid and ceasefire. I don't know if you want me to get more elaborate than that, but that's been, I think if I were to pretend it was something other than that, I would be dishonest. I think that's really it. And long-term solution. Would you like me to elaborate?
That is obviously a question. That's not even asking taking sides, right? I mean, that's a request that that is directed at everybody, and to some extent, yeah. I mean, part of the problem of talking about this conflict is that we're all equally powerless. I mean, none of us are in a position to affect change immediately. And so that sense of...
I don't think we're all, I mean, democracies, I think we have more power than some.
I should introduce myself because I think I forgot. So my name is AJ Levine. 2 things. Since October, I have increasingly, starting on a very high level of respect, increasingly respected my colleague Michael's ability to tell me where what I thought was an okay statement turned out not to be, because we don't hear through each other's ears. So increasingly I've become aware of how important it is to work with trusted friends who might have a different perspective than mine, to make sure that what I'm saying rings true rather than has false notes to it so publicly. Michael, thank you for those conversations. I'm not optimistic. I think hope is overrated. What I've been doing with churches is trying to provide them a different visual image. So yes, that's my idea of picturing my children in the front pew. And if you wouldn't say something in front of my little Jewish kids, they're now in their 30s, or picturing me in the back pew, that can be helpful. I spent some time working on the parables of Jesus as Jewish stories, and I found it helpful in Christian settings to retell the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I'm trusting you know, and just do the geography, because ancient Samaria is more or less the West Bank. So to say, what does that parable sound like in modern terms? I'm a Jew going down the Jerusalem-Jericho road, and I'm attacked by bandits. And two people who should have stopped to help and who had no excuse not to walk by. And the first one who walks by is a member of Churches for Middle East Peace. And the second person who walks by is a representative of Shalom Akshav, Peace Now. And the person who stops to help me is a Palestinian Muslim member of Hamas. So that's difficult to picture. But I think if we can reframe it to say, there's a possibility here. So we don't demonize the enemy, because once we demonize the enemy, then it's supernatural. We can't do anything. But if you humanize and you open up the door to the possibility of compassion, then I think it works pretty well. If Jesus were a Samaritan, the parable would be called the parable of the good Jew, which is a problematic term for a variety of reasons. But we can play that in reverse as well. And just to imagine that one single person that you might think wants to kill you is the very person who's going to save your life. And just to be able to change that image allows me to picture something different. So if you tell the story differently, perhaps that story could lead to something better later.
I think I'll pick up on that because you named a few things I was mulling over. So at the end of the day, I'm really all about Jesus in my personal life. So Jesus the Jew actually matters quite a bit to me. And especially his teaching to love your enemies, which is, I'm really good at hating people, partly because I'm from Boston. So, I hold a grudge really well. So I often try to imagine as if I don't have any enemies, which for me is like one of the hardest things to do. And I think this current situation, we're asked to say, who do you think your enemy is? And that's not just around October 7th, but that's the whole experience of polarization in the United States over the past decade. You have to pick a side. You have to have an enemy. If you don't have an enemy, you're probably my enemy. And so to live in a way as if one doesn't have an enemy might also be to live in this way of seeing the humanity in another person that you don't want to see the humanity in. But I also realize that, can I talk about privilege? That's a very privileged thing for me to say as a white man in the United States who is heterosexual and presents as male and everything else. There's a lot of privilege with that. I'm Christian, I'm white, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a professor. So I can't expect my disposition of other people. I can't expect that other people ought to behave as I behave or live the same way in the world as I live, because they are also carrying their own narratives. So it's I just find myself in this balancing act with different people. And I think I'll leave it there.
I understand the counsel against demonization. I really take that, and the enemy. However, I've embodied the Nazi long enough, living in the United States, working on Nazi Germany, and being, a child of a Nazi family. And of course, Nazi is sort of the ultimate image. I mean, maybe Hamas will come close to it, but Nazi is sort of the code for evil. And so, on the one hand, I obviously know the humanity. And just by sort of doing this kind of work with synagogues also, I know that moment of recognizing me as claiming the Nazi heritage and being human, what the kind of work that does. However, on the other hand, Nazism was defeated. And on the battlefield with enormous destruction, and then they were prosecuted and convicted. And without that defeat, both militarily and legally, I don't know that it would have been, that I could have had this kind of reconciliation work, if that's what it is. So, what does that mean for Hamas? What does it mean to speak of ceasefire? Unless there's also an accountability and a defeat. And what does it mean for, of course, the civilian population? The people in Frankfurt, in Dresden, in Hamburg, who were not. That question of how to deal with enemies, and that cannot mean that we don't have enemies. There are enemies, and the question is, strategically, how do we engage? What are the rules of engagement with that? So, and that's of course part of the Christian-Jewish dynamic has been that, the Christians talk about peace and peace and peace and reconciliation, and that's just not honest or not appropriate for the situation where, we're dealing with severe, with violence. So, what does it mean to talk of ceasefire?
Not representing a perspective here. You asked me Palestinian Christian perspective. I gave the perspective. The details of it, I don't know. I feel like you're coming from, speaking of the Nazi background and the defeat of Nazi, you're highlighting the difficulties and necessity of war and why it makes ceasefire difficult, which I recognize. I think I would just prefer, and this maybe is speaking from my own spiritual tradition, to highlight the necessity and importance of ceasefire and why that makes the need for violence more difficult. I don't know. I mean, you highlighted the point that I would make, when there's a clear battlefront, if I can say that about World War II, maybe I can't even really say that very clearly, but when there's a semi-clear battlefront, it's a very different kind of question. I know. Someone else wants to explain it.
So, I'm not going to talk about that, but but I do want to say something that connects, I think, and about two truths that I think that somehow have to have room next to each other. And this, in October 7th in Israel, it was really strange because there was no state for a moment. That was the experience, at least. The state didn't function. The army didn't function. The police didn't function. There were people going there after people realized what is happening in the south and doing all kinds of acts of heroic acts, but it was really personal. It was in individuals and not this. It took a while until until it felt that the framework of the state got back to function. And in a sense, it was a moment of experience. What does it mean to be without a state? We had a chance to suddenly feel that, and I think many of us also reminded why we thought that the state is a good idea to begin with, because for a moment there was no state there, right? It was the sovereign state of Israel, the 48th state, that it happened over there, right? So, and this, I think many of us were thrown back into Jewish history in a way. Let's not go into the question whether these analogy are appropriate and what exactly they do. They do all kinds of stuff, but this is what is happening. It's like naked Jewish life without ability of defending ourselves, and this was really. It was a new thing, I think, for Israelis. So in a way, this is a very strong experience that I wouldn't want to marginalize at all. I think it's central. I think it's important. On the other hand, and this really means that, yeah, we want to have the ability to defend ourselves. But of course, there is also... Now, in Germany, I think it's easy to sympathize with that because you also remember, right? You remember being on the other side of that. So it throws both of us somehow to these memories, but it doesn't have to throw Michael into these same memories. And my position and the memories that I have of Michael, so to say, or the culture that he represents, though he really does not represent anything, and neither do I, but we still are also embedded in our own communities and cultures. So there is also a different thing that is going on there, and it is very hard to hold on to these encounters together. And it's also about, right, the Middle Easterns encountering the West, right? This is another complexity that adds up to that. And we want to have, I mean, we all have to navigate between these different, it's not narratives that can be simply reduced. It's all true. It's just incredibly complicated. So I know that there is, I see a lot this slogan that silence is complicity. And this is also something that we learned, I think, from the Holocaust. And there is a lot of truth in that. But there is something also about not being silent when things are so complicated and your opinions, you voice them readily. Which is also, I'm not sure that it's much less problematic than being silent. So I'm not saying that people should be complicit or silent, but I think we can be more careful in terms of the opinions that we voice.
So I wonder whether we should open up to some questions. If there are questions in the audience, I will come around and give you the mic and take it away if you're inappropriate. Is there a question here? Now you're all scared. Okay, okay.
Maybe I would like to give a comment if that's okay, because I was like listening to it, and especially about the kind of where the differences are, where the borderlines are between the positions, which is quite obvious, is a question from a religious point of view, because at the end of the day we are all religious people here, and I think that's in a way we also always have a theological perspective, a religious perspective. This is one of our identities. And I really wonder if it's possible from that point of view to have a common ground, because we do have ethical moral values which actually do unite us or put us together regardless of all the differences of our faith or our religious practice. And so in this case of October 7th, of course there is not not such a clear answer to say this is the good side, this is the bad side. But in a way, yeah, there is the question of ethical, moral behavior on the one side, values which we all share, and then a barbarian act by the Hamas. Now, for me, it's important. It's not by the Palestinians, but it's by the Hamas. But there's the question if it's possible to say, for example, those Christian Palestinians who are also suffering now, there is no doubt about it, if they should not actually kind of unite with us on the Jewish side, Israeli side, whatever, you know, against this barbarity of Hamas, you know, for not only our sake, but also their own sake. Of course, the question is, like, I mean, it's just very theoretical because I know realities on the ground is a different thing. And what could probably Christians in Palestine, Israel, what can they do? How strong is their influence? But is there maybe a perspective? Is there maybe a possibility to link?
I would just like to first say that that's now the third comment/question directed at me in a row. So maybe on to someone else next. But to answer very briefly that idea of, you asked specifically of Palestinian Christians, but Palestinian Christians, I think anyone who has experience even prior to this, well, say it's okay. So Palestinian Christians do not share, on the whole, the ideology, tactics, and interests of Hamas, or whatever else you want to add to that sentence. But anyone that has experience within Palestinian communities, especially in the West Bank, and then especially Gaza, I mean prior to now, and not even there, but within Israel to a certain degree, depending on where exactly you're talking about, would, on the whole, find it very difficult, would find it very easy to understand why they can't side with the one against the one that they might like less or worse. I mean, did I say that right? They don't like anymore. I don't know. It's a very difficult, you know, I just don't see it.
Thank you for this talk. I have two questions. The one is about reconciliation. Hannah Arendt writes in Vita Activa that Jesus invited reconciliation, which might be wrong. So I would like to ask, is there no reconciliation in the Torah? And if there is one, aren't there also, as in the Christian tradition, conditions for reconciliation? Reconciliation doesn't just happen. There has to be insight into the fault of the own things I did, into guilt. There has to be go back to the situation, meet the victim of my action, of my guilt, and do it better in the future. So what does reconciliation mean in the actual situation? In my mind, there is never a reconciliation without seeing the guilt, as Katharina von Kellenbach said, as we had it in Germany. And we have to talk about the difference between terror and war, however dangerous and producing victims again. And the other question is more fundamentally, we are religious people talking about politics. And so I would be happy if the difference between politics and theology would be a bit more clearer than we had it in the last round.
The interest in separating theology from politics typically comes from those who can afford to separate theology from politics. And in just, I mean, maybe I'll let Carmen explain, you can't do that where, you can't, it's not easy to separate. I mean, since one's religious background is actually part of, in a sense, national identity, in much of the Middle East and many other places, it's very difficult to do. But I don't, maybe I'll follow.
Yeah, first of all, I would say that it's a Middle Eastern thing to mix. And it's very ancient as well. And in a way, I would also add that when thinking about Jewish-Christian relations, seriously, it was always mixed. It was always about the minority-majority relations. So theology is very much mixed in that, in terms of the Jewish-Christian relationship. It's not only about the Jewishness of Jesus, it's also about whether Jews are testifying to the truth of Christianity since they're dispersed in the Christian world, for example. So it's always part of also about the political strength, power of the Messiah. So it's really within the beating heart of the Jewish-Christian tension from time immemorial, in a sense. Sometimes I think we all hope that we could adopt the Western perspective on these things, even though, as you know, Westerners are not that good at separating themselves. But for now, when thinking about dialogue in the Middle East, I would say that the whole setting is different, that the definition of dialogue has to contain the political tensions, and that it's never clear what comes first, whether, you know, politics is just abusing theology or theology is abusing politics, or maybe there's no abuse and we're simply living these things together, which I tend to, this is, you know, my inclination is to think this way.
Can I also jump in and make an argument to the contrary, that I don't think this is really about reconciliation, but about politics and political solutions, hardcore, pragmatic, political agreements, which may not feel good to anybody, right? I mean, reconciliation cannot be the beginning, but the end. And first, I think we need negotiated settlements of conflicts. And that's not at all our expertise. I'm not in political science. We're not diplomats. I don't know how to do that. But so I think we also do well to own our strengths and admit where, you know, I don't do military strategy and I don't do diplomacy. That's not my field of expertise. And reconciliation is one of those terms, or peace is one of those terms that travels from one field to the other. And I think that's very dangerous. And that's where I would take your your critique of Western language, that there's slippage between these fields. So I think one more. Oh.
Can I say something about the previous question while you walk?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that question. One of the reasons I stress the idea of Jews as a people rather than Jews as simply a faith community or as a religion already shows the intertwinedness of religion and all those other categories, politics, sociology, etc. So I don't think they can be separated. I find my Christian friends ask invariably about reconciliation and forgiveness. And those are the two categories that they're mostly invested in. And I'm not invested in either. I don't care about reconciliation, and I'm not interested in forgiveness. I just don't want people killing each other. So if we can get to détente, I'm okay with that. If we can just put the bombs down, I'm okay with that. And maybe when the Messiah comes or comes back, then we can have reconciliation and forgiveness. But until then, I think those are luxuries.
Even though just one comment, even though I just said theology and politics are not entirely separable, I will speak personally and theologically of my own spiritual tradition that most informs my own personal approach to this. Heavily influenced by Orthodox spiritual tradition, where the other is always less of a sinner than I am. And that informs the way, ideally informs the way I speak to people, not always in the heat of the moment, perhaps. But.
Yeah, just quickly, just to come back on the question of this relationship between religion and politics. Just to me, the question is, I'll phrase it a little bit differently. Of course, it's not for religion to do military strategy or for religion to do politics, at least not in the sense that we understand it like this. However, I'm very suspicious and very afraid of religions that shy away from the complexity of political realities. And that's a very different thing. It's not about doing politics, it's not about taking a political stance, it's not about being active in politics, but it's about a religion that is not satisfied by being a prophetic religion. A prophetic religion is very good, but life is more complex than just a prophetic religion. There's not just the prophet, there's also the king, and there's also the priest. And it's the interaction that works, but the interaction only works if the prophet somehow understands that reality is more complex than what the prophet imagines. And I think from that point of view, I think a religion that shies away from the complexity of politics is actually quite a dangerous step to take, because it leaves the door open for anybody else to come and take that space.
Did you want to comment? Last thoughts? I guess there's no, we all agree. That's a very good point. We have 1 minute left. Is there anything that needs to be said before we conclude this panel discussion?
I think it wasn't that bad after all.
I am now happy to be here.
Yeah. So you can tell that we were very concerned and anxious about this conversation, and I think we really learned and listened, and we very much appreciate your patience and your supportive presence. I mean, I felt, this was not a hostile audience by any means, and so we thank you very much for being here, and we thank those who were streaming, listening in from abroad, from the United States, from Israel, from wherever, and we hope that we can, that this is a beginning, and that we were able to model a way of confronting these complexities that are clearly we're in the middle of and the beginning of, and not even close to an end. So thank you very much, and yeah, I can't speak of hope, right? We're not doing hope for the future, but let's hope that that things will get better, that we will be able to move this mountain a little bit, even though it seems impossible. So, a very good evening.